A few months ago, a coaching client of mine, a full stack engineer, told me about a product she'd been engaged to test. It was a biometric health tool, which scored her overall wellness out of 100. Most days, the number came back around 70 to 80. Solid, healthy. And then one day, it suddenly dropped to 30. Now, on this system's scale, 30 doesn't mean rest or go and drink some more water. It literally means go and seek urgent medical attention. She wasn't dying. She wasn't even unwell. She was on her period. The product had already shipped. It was already live. It was on the market, being trusted every day by people making decisions about their own bodies. But it failed for around half the population for roughly a quarter of every month. Evidently, the algorithm had never met a uterus before. Now, nobody in that design or that development team set out to build something that was inaccurate. But a group of really clever, very well-intentioned people did just that, because nobody in that room had the kind of body that would have prompted them to ask the right question. I guess that just goes to show you can have a room with an average IQ of 145 and still miss something painfully obvious. But that pattern doesn't stop with one wellness tracker having a bad day. It runs all the way through technology. Joy Bulanwini and Timnit Gebru's gender shades research found facial analysis error rates of 34.7% for darker skinned women compared to 0.8% for lighter skinned men. Clinical risk tools used in healthcare systems have been found to underestimate how unwell a patient actually is when that patient comes from an ethnic minority background, because the historical data that those tools learned from reflects a healthcare system that had already been undertreating those same patients for years. The data sets these systems learn from carry the assumptions and the blind spots and the omissions of whoever built them and whoever wasn't in the room when they were built. So when a healthcare app or a symptom tracker isn't trained on diverse genders, ethnicities, disabilities, or body types, it can make really dangerous errors about a client's own body. And it'll do so with absolute confidence because that's what AI tools are trained to do. I recognise this pattern so clearly because I've spent my entire career tracking it from various different angles. As a financial services litigator, my job was to ask whether the right people were in the room when a financial product was designed and sold. When I was in international development and on the board of Amnesty International UK, I watched the same patterns of exclusion show up again and again. I'm now working across AI governance and human-centered leadership, and I see exactly the same structural failures repeating themselves with these automated tools. So I'm not here to sell you an easy fix. There isn't one. When people and planet collide with technology and profit, it gets really messy fast. But I am here to show you how to narrow the gap between who gets harmed and who gets hurt. A few months ago, I was asked to speak on BBC Radio about deepfake bodies being used in content on social media to promote or sell fitness and well-being products and programs. Quite aside from being a massive breach of advertising standards, because these bodies literally cannot exist, and so there's no way a content creator would be able to satisfy the requirement that health claims need to be evidenced. But it reminded me of the airbrushing debates that we had when I was in my 20s, which of course was only a couple of years ago. The way that people then compared themselves to unrealistic body images is exactly the same pattern we are seeing being amplified on social media at scale as a result of AI. Bodies that are physiologically impossible, proportions that no human skeleton could possibly support. They're being served up by algorithms that have learned exactly which images keep somebody scrolling just that little bit longer. Cosmetic surgeons are even starting to report something that they've begun to call AI face. Patients are arriving at consultations clutching AI-generated portraits of themselves, larger eyes and smoother skin, remodeled bone structures. These faces don't follow any known rules of human anatomy, but people are coming in, clutching their printout and asking what it'll cost to look like that. The surgeon has to gently explain that what the patient is holding isn't a reference photo, it's a fabrication. It cannot be reproduced because it was never real to begin with. Everything I've just described has been happening to your clients, whether you've ever opened an AI tool or not. And if it's true for them, it's worth turning the same question into your own business. Because the chances are that you're already using AI, even if you've never called it that. Whether that's drafting an email with a bit of help, or getting a research summary, maybe using a tool that transcribes or summarizes your sessions. For the vast majority of practitioners, this isn't a future scenario. It's happening in daily practice. Here's where I want to draw directly from my own field of international development, because I think it's a really useful framework. It's called Free Prior Informed Consent, or FPIC. It comes from the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and it holds that a community has the right to give or withhold consent to any resource, tangible or intangible, that belongs to an Indigenous or a local community. So consent would only be considered legal or legally binding if it's free from coercion or hidden in terms and conditions, given prior to the data being collected or processed, and based on information that is accurate. Now, I'm not suggesting that FPIC applies to a coaching contract in a strict legal sense. But as an ethical framework, it's really powerful because it forces us to confront the power imbalance between the practitioner and the client. It moves us beyond tick box compliance, and it asks a fundamental question. Are we giving our clients genuine agency over how we use their words and experience? To understand why this matters so urgently in practice, I want to consider the case of Jennifer Camras. Jennifer was a nurse practitioner who used Talkspace, a therapy platform offered through her employer's benefit scheme, to process the anxiety of losing her job whilst she was nearly 9 months pregnant. When she later filed a pregnancy discrimination claim against her employer, her therapy notes were subpoenaed. So whilst a traditional therapist might hold brief, high-level clinical notes, Talkspace had stored a complete word-for-word transcript of every single message she'd ever sent. That transcript was then produced in court and used directly against her. My professional career began in law, and one of the very first things you learn as a litigator is that confidentiality and legal privilege are so fragile. Confidentiality can be destroyed the moment that information which is for a protected relationship gets routed through a third-party system that isn't bound by those same duties. Nothing was hacked in the Camras space. Talkspace's CEO has openly told investors that the platform holds 8 billion words and 140 million messages of client disclosures, all being used to train their proprietary AI models. The permanent storage of Jennifer's disclosures wasn't an accidental glitch. It was literally the business model. So when you introduce an AI note taker or a transcription bot or a third-party app into a coaching session, you are introducing a third party into that room. And if that tool is used to train on your client's most sensitive reflections, you just might be using software and waiving the very confidentiality that your client is trusting you to protect. When I talk to health, well-being and coaching practitioners about AI compliance, the most frequent response I hear is, well, this doesn't apply to me because I don't use AI in my practice. I don't use ChatGPT to write my notes, or I haven't built a custom chatbot. You don't need to actively download a new AI application or seek out emerging technology to be processing client data through machine learning models. The software you possibly bought years ago, the platforms you already use every day for scheduling, for video calls, word processing, email, they've been updating their terms of service, and they might already have enabled automated processing by default. You just don't know about it. Now, this is what we call embedded default enabled AI. It's a technology that's been woven silently into the digital infrastructure of modern practice. So I want to look at 3 examples of how this might play out in a standard everyday setup. Number 1, you host a video session on a standard platform. Over the weekend, the platform rolls out an update featuring automated meeting summaries or a sentiment tracking. Unless an administrator manually digs through the multi-layered settings to turn those features off, session audio or real-time text is processed on remote cloud servers, frequently with default clauses that grant the vendor the rights to retain that data for system optimization. Number 2, you might install an assistant app to capture session actions or turn Spooker notes into client summaries. It feels like an administrative helper, but actually behind that user-friendly interface, it's a third-party capture, which is taking all of those voice biometrics and converting unstructured client reflections into structured text data sets, which often permanently sit in servers outside your legal jurisdiction. Thirdly, you might open your standard word processor or email client to draft a post-session follow-up. Quite often, modern tools now feature a generative suggestion operating in the background. So the moment you type a client's sensitive reflection into that document, those words are transmitted to external servers for processing, for tone analysis, or for completion suggestions. Now, none of this happens because you set out to breach confidentiality or you cut corners. It happens because software design has shifted from explicit opt-in to default-enabled extraction. So when a vendor updates their system to process text or voice or video through an automated model, they aren't asking for your client's consent, and they certainly aren't asking for yours. They're relying on the assumption that you'll press accept on a 40-page terms of service update without reading the fine print. The critical question for every practitioner isn't, am I choosing to use AI? It's, do I know where the software I already rely on is routing my client's voice, words, and personal disclosures behind the scenes? So what do you actually do about this? How do you take back control of your practice data? Well, it starts with moving from this passive user to active administrator. Firstly, recognize that the software vendors are intentionally making these controls as hard as possible to find. You're rarely going to find a switch to turn off the background data processing in your desktop app. It almost always sits inside your web-based account administration panel. So it will be buried under third-party integrations, smart features, or background data sharing permissions. Second, you have to establish a clear policy for your tech stack. If a tool processes client words, voice, or notes, you either toggle off the AI processing completely or you negotiate a verified enterprise agreement where the vendor contractually agrees zero data retention and zero model training for your inputs. If a tool doesn't give you that choice, it doesn't belong, in my view, in a confidential health or coaching environment. So the third is then taking control of your software settings. And that isn't a technical task, it's just an act of client care. It's how we ensure that our digital practice matches our legal and our ethical promises. Now, I want to be very clear about something. Pointing out the flaws and risks in current AI tools is not an argument for abandoning the technology altogether. Artificial intelligence isn't inherently unethical, but it isn't neutral either. When AI is developed with proper boundaries, zero data retention guarantees, and explicit human oversight, it can be an extraordinary force for good in the health, well-being, and human services space. Positive, ethical AI within the health and well-being sectors usually falls into 3 distinct patterns. Number 1, the most immediate ethical win for any practitioner is using non-retention AI tools and strictly for back-end, non-sensitive administrative workflows, generating public marketing content or optimizing scheduling for a calendar, drafting a generic workshop outline, or maybe summarizing anonymized research papers can save an independent practitioner between 5 to 10 hours of cognitive burden every single week. So when you use isolated AI models that don't ingest or store client records, you can free up energy and time for the one thing that machine learning can never replicate: genuine, present, empathetic human connection. Number 2, where AI truly shines is in breaking down accessibility barriers for neurodivergent individuals or people living with physical and cognitive impairments. We're seeing remarkable AI-driven communication tools that run entirely on local devices. So that's no cloud uploads and no external data harvesting. These tools can help non-verbal individuals express really complex emotional states. They can assist people with ADHD in organising overwhelming schedules, or translate speech into real time for those with sensory or auditory processing differences. In these cases, the AI isn't replacing human relationships or evaluating a person's worth. It is serving as a personalized prosthetic for agency and communication. Thirdly, in clinical and public health settings, AI models are proving really valuable when they're trained on structured, high-quality medical data sets, almost like acting as a second pair of eyes for a healthcare professional. Whether that might be spotting early signs of a cardiac anomaly in an ECG reading, or helping radiographers flag up subtle tissue changes in scans. The ethical model here follows a strict rule though. The AI offers a suggestion, but it is a qualified human practitioner that retains total decision-making authority. Crucially, in these ethical implications, the software operates under strict zero data retention agreements. Patient records are analysed locally in a secure sandbox, and then the data is erased immediately after the output is generated. It's never retained to train global foundation models. But the common thread across every single positive example is that ethical AI empowers the human. It doesn't extract from them. It operates with transparency, it respects personal boundaries, and it never treats persons' lived experience or health disclosures as raw material for a corporate algorithm. As health and wellbeing practitioners, that is the exact same standard of care we have to demand from any tool that we invite into our own practice. In many ways, our existing data protection laws already attempt to enforce this level of care. Before we look at AI regulation specifically, we need to address a fundamental law that many practitioners outside the UK or the EU assume doesn't apply to them, and that's the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. Introduced in 2018, GDPR is the gold standard for global privacy. It governs how organisations collect, store, handle and share personal data, which is defined as any information that could identify a living person. Most coaches, consultants and international practitioners think, well, I'm based in the US or Australia or South Africa, so European data law really isn't my concern. That assumption is wrong. GDPR's scope is extraterritorial. It doesn't care where your business is registered, or where your bank account lives, or where you are physically sitting when you deliver a session. It applies if you offer services to or process the data of anyone living in the UK or the European Union. So if you offer up a wellbeing app, or you collect and store the email address of someone you're planning to market to, or if someone in the UK or the EU pays for your course or your coaching or your live sessions, you're in scope. Under GDPR, processing personal data requires adhering to basic non-negotiable rules: lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. So you have to have a valid legal reason to process the data, and you have to be completely open with your clients about how it's being used. You have to only collect data for explicit stated reasons, and you can only collect strictly what you need to collect. You have to ensure that the data is protected from unauthorized exposure or third-party misuse. While basic contact information like a client's name or email address requires standard care, coaching conversations almost instantly call into a much stricter legal classification, which is called special category data. Under Article 9, certain types of personal information are recognised as being inherently sensitive because they include information revealing physical or medical conditions, mental health or emotional states or psychological well-being, maybe racial or ethnic origin, or sexual orientation and religious beliefs. In health, coaching or wellbeing practice, your clients are regularly sharing their struggles with you, their personal health goals or neurodivergent diagnoses, maybe emotional burnout or deeply private experiences of trauma. And they're sharing it with you. They are trusting you and your discretion, your professional framework and your ethics code. The moment that information is recorded or written down, you are processing a special category of data. And the baseline rule for this special category data is simple. Processing it is prohibited unless you meet a strict exception. And this isn't some sort of passive, by continuing this session, you agree to our privacy policy link buried in a footer. It needs you to have an active, informed, and explicit opt-in. You have to literally get explicit permission from your client. So if you feed a session, an audio or a live transcript or summary notes or something like that into a third-party AI tool, then without exception, you are sharing that information with the bot. And without explicit consent that explains how the AI processes that sensitive data, you're not just stretching an ethical boundary, you're likely in breach of data protection law. Now that brings us directly to the EU AI Act, which is the world's first comprehensive law specifically regulating artificial intelligence. If GDPR sets the rules for data, the EU AI Act sets the rules for the tools that handle that data. Just like GDPR, its scope follows the client. So if your client is in the EU, your practice might be in scope regardless of where you're based. If you are using AI tools in your practice, there are compliant obligations that could apply to you right now. The EU AI Act came into force in August 2024, and it's rolling out its obligations in stages. Here's the part that catches almost everyone by surprise. It doesn't apply based on where your business is registered or where you're sitting where you delivered a session. It applies based on where the person who is affected by the tool is located. So if you're coaching a client or delivering an online session to someone who happens to be in Germany or France or anywhere else in the EU, at the point that the AI tool processes something about them, the Act could apply to you. But I don't want you suddenly having a massive panic attack because whilst it is a really significant piece of legislation, I promise you it is way more manageable than it first seems. The Act works on a tiered risk model. At the top, there are certain AI practices which are completely banned outright. So that's things like systems using subliminal manipulation or that exploit vulnerable people or deploy social scoring. Below that sits the high risk tier, which is where most of the most significant compliance obligations live. Below that, limited risk, where basic transparency requirements apply. And at the bottom, there's minimal risk, which is largely unregulated. Now, where does coaching sit? The honest answer is it completely depends on what you're doing and with what tools. The Act doesn't name coaching as a category specifically, but Annex 3, which lists those high-risk use cases, includes systems where healthcare, education, and employment contexts can significantly affect people's health or safety or fundamental rights. But it also explicitly captures AI systems that profile individuals by processing personal data to assess aspects of a person's life. Now that could include their health or emotional state, their preferences and their behaviours. So if you're using an AI tool that analyses your client's responses or tracks patterns or makes inferences about their psychological state or informs decisions about how you support them, you might well operate in a high risk territory, or at the very minimum in territory that requires you to have thought really, really carefully about where you sit on that spectrum. So some scoping is well required. However, what is not a grey area and what's been enforced since February 2025 is Article 4, and that requires anyone providing or using an AI system to make sure the people operating it, including you and anyone working alongside you, have a genuine level of AI literacy and not just knowing what buttons to push. If any of this feels overwhelming, please let me pause and give you some perspective. None of this is about pointing fingers, and the coaching industry has had almost no practical plain English guidance on AI governance. Most of you have never been told these rules because the conversation's been dominated by big tech, and the practical guidance for independent practitioners has been virtually non-existent. But knowing where the legal and ethical lines doesn't have to be a burden. It can be a commercial asset. It allows you to assure your clients, to protect your contracts, and to demonstrate a level of rigor that sets your practice apart. So let's talk now about how we put that into practice. A talk like this isn't really worth much if you leave feeling informed but unable to act. So I want to leave you with a clear roadmap for what I think should happen next, which is structured around shifts that you can make in your practice now, Firstly, know your boundaries. Don't guess about whether you're in scope for GDPR or the EU AI Act. Find out. Audit your client footprint and your tool stack so you know exactly where your legal and ethical obligations lie. And if you're struggling with that, give me a shout. I'd be really happy to help. Secondly, be really transparent about how you're using AI and processing data. Don't bury terms and conditions. Move towards transparent, plain English contracting. When a client sees that you've got a deliberate and thoughtful policy on AI and data privacy, it doesn't scare them off, it builds immediate trust. Third, build the culture, not just the document. True psychological safety and AI literacy, they're not static statements on a website. They are lived operational habits, and it's about how you check in about tools, how you handle transcripts, how you respect agency in every single session, and how you talk about it and how you share your knowledge with your community. Fourth, zero client data rules. The foundation of digital integrity is really simple. Identifiable client disclosures and special category data shouldn't ever enter general purpose cloud trained LLMs. Your operational standard has to be absolute. If a tool uses your inputs to train global models, it is barred from your clinical practice and your coaching workflows. If you use generative tools for practice administration, do it completely in isolation from client records and use zero identifiable outputs. Fifth, continuous vendor governance software. Oh my goodness, it's a lot, isn't it? It's not just a one-time setup. Vendors are constantly updating their terms of service. They're launching new features, adding default settings constantly. So if you're going to be an ethical practitioner, it means maintaining an active duty of care over your tech stack. So unfortunately, that's boring admin updates on a regular basis, at least twice a year, to make sure that there aren't features that have been added that you're not aware of. And ask your software vendors 3 basic questions before you sign up. Do you train on my data? Do you offer zero data retention? And what are your processing servers located? If a vendor can't provide those plain English answers to 3 questions, switch providers. To help you put all of this into practice, I've put together a free responsible AI practitioner guide, and that includes all the information contained in this presentation, which I know is a lot, and I'm sorry about that, but it is important. It also includes a jurisdiction scoping model, so you can see whether you're in scope for the GDPR and EU AI Act, and an AI data and ethics policy template, which you can adapt for your own business. Also included is a practical guide to digital agency and psychological safety, and finally, step-by-step instructions on how to look at your terms and conditions and toggle off the settings that you maybe don't need to have on your AI tools currently. If you'd like a copy, please drop me an email and I'd be delighted to send it to you over straight. There's no doubt that artificial intelligence is going to continue to shape how we work and communicate and live. But what it can't do is offer presence. It can't offer genuine empathy. It cannot hold space for humans who are suffering or facilitate true personal transformation. Those capabilities belong uniquely to human practitioners. And when we demand transparency from our software vendors, when we lock down default AI toggles, and when we stand up for clients' data sovereignty, we're not just complying with regulations like the GDPR or the EU AI Act. We are setting the standard for what human-centered practice really looks like in the 21st century. Technology should serve human agency and not extract from it. And by implementing these really simple guardrails today, you start to ensure that your practice remains grounded in trust, in safety, and in uncompromising care. You didn't design the regulatory landscape and you didn't build these tools, but how you choose to steward your clients' trust inside them, that part's entirely yours.